Championship fan base is the most loyal? Alright, we'll never fully know the answer to that, but what we're going to be doing in today's video is looking at each Championship club's attendances over the last 10 years and seeing just how much they fluctuated in that time, using the sort of logic that the less of a fluctuation there's been, the more loyal that fan base has been in terms of showing up regularly throughout the last 10 years. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've taken each Championship club's lowest average attendance in any of the last 10 seasons and compared it to their highest average attendance in any of the last 10 years. Obviously, worth pointing out first of all, I have ignored the COVID years within this, so those figures won't be taken into consideration here. And also, I must stress, this video is just for a little bit of fun. Obviously, there are a bunch of reasons as to why attendance figures will fluctuate when it comes to boycotts, ticket prices, a team being promoted or relegated, but this gives us an interesting indication of just how much the attendance figures have changed at Championship clubs throughout the last 10 years. If you do go on to enjoy today's video, make sure to drop a like, but without any further ado, let's jump in. Unsurprisingly, coming in at the bottom of this list, it is Coventry, with by far and away the biggest percentage change in attendances, their lowest being just over 9,100 and their highest being this season just over 23,000. Now, the numbers with Coventry, I will say that I didn't include the years they played at Birmingham or Northampton, as I felt it was a little bit unfair to compare those attendance figures when they've actually played at their own home stadium. So in the last 10 years, when they have played at the Ricoh, the lowest attendance figures have been just over 9,100. That was when they were in League One. Compared to their highest figures at 23,000, that's a massive percentage change. Club that has experienced the second most amount of change in attendance figures throughout this 10-year period has been Plymouth Argyle. These days, you'd struggle to get a ticket there. They sell it out most weeks, don't they? But that wasn't always the case. Their lowest attendance in these last 10 years being 7,300. That was when the club was in League Two, and you can see there 125% percentage change, massive increase on previous years. 22nd place on this list, we've got Hull City, and boy has that fan base been through the trials and tribulations over this last decade, from the Premier League to the Championship to League One, different ownership models, and the fluctuation in fans has sort of been a result of all of that chaos. Unsurprisingly, Hull's crowds were at their peak while they were playing in the Premier League. Crowds actually dipped to their lowest point in the 18/19 season. Overall, they've had a fluctuation of 96.5% in fans. I was fairly surprised to see Middlesbrough this low down on the list. They have had really consistent numbers over the last 8 or so years, but compared to the numbers they've got of late, their crowds in the 13/14 season were significantly lower. They were only averaging 15,700 that season, and at their peak when they were in the Premier League, they were bringing in more than 30,000 fans. That gives them quite a big fluctuation of 93.3% from their highest to lowest point over these last 10 years. In 20th place, we've got Cardiff. Did expect quite a big fluctuation from them. Obviously, they hit their peak in terms of attendances while they were a Premier League club, bringing in over 31,000 fans that season. In most of their campaigns as a Championship club, they're averaging in and around that 20k mark, but crowds for Cardiff were particularly low in the 2015/16 season. That's what gives them this big fluctuation of 90%. Next up on this ranking, we've got Huddersfield Town. Their attendances hit a 10-year low in the 2015/16 season. During that campaign, they were just averaging over 12,600 fans, and at their very peak as a Premier League club, they were just getting over 24k. That's what gives them the fluctuation of 90.3% in total. 18th on this list, it's Bristol City. At least for the last 7 or so seasons, their attendance figures have been really solid, and their attendance figures have actually peaked this season in terms of the last 10 years, with crowds of over 21,000 visiting Ashton Gate at the moment. Wasn't always the case. Their crowds hit a lower point during that period in League One, although it is worth flagging up that Ashton Gate has gone through so much redevelopment work in that time. Remember a point where there was only 3 stands at the ground, for example. For Bristol City over this 10-year period, they've seen a 78.5% change from their lowest to highest point. I expected Ipswich to have quite a big percentage change on today's video. That is the case. A 76.9% change in total from their lowest to highest point. What I found quite interesting about Ipswich's average attendance figures is they They actually hit their lowest point when they were in the Championship previously. Their attendances actually started to rise when they got relegated to League One. Ipswich's lowest attendance over these last 10 years came in the 2017/18 season. That was Mick McCarthy's final year at the club, and I think that really emphasises how much that fan base had just completely checked out of the club by that point because of how mind-numbingly dumb the football was. You know, their attendance figures actually went up in the year they got relegated from the Championship compared to Mick's final season in charge, but absolutely massive crowds there now at Portman Road, over 28,000 this season. While Millwall's attendance figures have been really stable over these last 6 or so years, over a 10-year period, they have seen quite a drastic change. The lowest point Millwall hit in terms of fans visiting the stadium was in 2015/16. That's when they were in League One. They were attracting crowds of just over 9,100. Quite an increase from that point compared to now. 15th place on this list, it's Leeds United, one of the most recognisable fan bases in English football. While their support and attendance figures have been absolutely fantastic for the last maybe 6 or so years maybe, over a 10-year period their home attendance figures have fluctuated quite a lot by 62.9% in total. The lowest point Leeds hit in terms of attendance figures over these last 10 seasons was in the 2015/16 campaign. They were averaging just over 22,000 fans during that campaign, and obviously since that point, attendance figures have dramatically risen, now to over 36,000 fans. 14th place on this list, it's my team Preston North End. The lowest point we've hit in terms of attendance figures over this last decade has been 10,200 fans compared to our peak, which is right now in terms of attendance figures at 16,500. Do think there's been quite a few incentives by North End to get more people in the stadium, whether it be slashing ticket prices, trying to improve the matchday experience, to get more bums on seats, and as you can see there, that has worked. It's a overall percentage increase for North End of 61.5%. 13th on this list, it's Sunderland. Boy, has that fan base been through a lot over these last 10 years. The lowest point their attendance figures actually hit was in 2017/18 when they were relegated from the Championship. During that campaign, Sunderland drawing crowds of just over 27,000 fans. I think during that period there were a lot of people who just completely lost faith with the direction of the football club. New ownership was obviously needed. They've got that now, and they've seen their attendance figures spike as a result of it. Bang in the middle of this table, we've got Stoke City. Their crowds have seen a fluctuation of 51.1%. The lowest attendance figures they've actually hit over this 10-year period is actually right now. It's this season where they're averaging just over 19,000 fans. That compared to their peak when they were in the Premier League, getting 29,000 fans. Starting now to get into some of the more smaller fluctuations we've seen in overall attendances. 11th on this video, we've got Birmingham. Interestingly, the highest point that Birmingham have hit in terms of home crowds was actually in the 2018/19 campaign. They finished 17th in the Championship that season under Gary Monk, but were drawing in crowds of 22,400 that season. The lowest point for their attendance figures was in 2013/14 when they were getting just over 15k fans. Unsurprisingly, when it comes to Swansea, their highest average attendances in this past decade were while they were a Premier League club, but since they've been relegated back down to the Championship, crowds haven't taken that drastic of a tail off. In total, it's a 36% fluctuation, but compared to some other Championship clubs who have gone back and forth between the Premier League and Championship, that's not that big of a change. It's quite a similar story when it comes to Watford in 9th place as well. Their biggest attendances coming while they were playing in the Premier League. Now in the Championship, they have taken a slight dip. During the last 10 years, Watford's lowest attendances actually came in 2013/14 when they were averaging just over 15,000 fans. In 8th place on this list, we've got Rotherham, the lowest attended Championship club, but you have to admit, home figures have been pretty consistent there throughout the years. Overall, it's a fluctuation of less than 30% in their home crowds from the highest to lowest point over these last 10 years. Usually they see a bit of a drop off in League One and a bit of a bump in the Championship, but not much between those two numbers there. In 7th place on this list, we've got QPR. Their crowds peaked at 17,800 while they were in the Premier League. The lowest point they hit in terms of home attendances was in 2018/19 when they only had 13,800 fans coming in. In 6th place on this video, we've got Leicester City. Now, if I'd done this over a 9-year period, Leicester Leicester might actually be top of this list with the smallest overall fluctuation. In the last 9 years, their crowds have been really consistent at hitting over 31,000 fans. But in the 2013/14 season, the first season taken into consideration for this video, they were averaging home crowds of just under 25,000. Compared to their peak, that gives them a fluctuation of 28.1%. But it is worth flagging up, for the last 9 or so years, their crowds have been pretty much the same week in, week out. 5th place on this video, we've got West Brom with quite a small fluctuation, given the 10-year period of 27.9%. Understandably, the Baggies' highest crowds coming while they were a Premier League club, compared to the lowest average attendance, which is just under 20k. 4th on this ranking, it's Sheffield Wednesday, and credit to that fan base for sticking by that team through thick and thin, because Wednesday fans have been through a hell of a lot over this last decade. At their lowest point in this last 10 years, they were averaging crowds of just over 21k, compared to their highest point, which is over 27,000. That's a fluctuation of just 27.7%, which is really quite small when compared to a lot of the other clubs, especially when you take into consideration the years they spent in League One, relegation from the Championship, the fact that Wednesday fans are paying for some of the most expensive season tickets in the Championship as well. Yeah, that's some going from Wednesday there. 3rd place on this list is Blackburn Rovers. Their attendance figures have barely changed whatsoever in this 10-year period. Obviously, if we took it back a little bit further than that 10-year period, went back to Blackburn's days in the Premier League, there would obviously be a much bigger fluctuation in those numbers. But based on the last decade, there's only been a 17.9% fluctuation in their crowds, which really isn't a lot. Blackburn fans do get quite a bit of banter for how empty that stadium is on a regular basis with how big Ewood Park actually is, but the size of that fan base has remained pretty consistent for the last 10 years now. I'd say the top 2 in this video though are especially impressive, because there's been pretty much no change whatsoever, and over a 10-year period that's really quite impressive. In 2nd place it is Norwich City, just with a 4.6% change in crowds from their lowest to highest point over these last 10 years. You regularly will get Carrow Road sold out on a match week. Also quite impressive as well that Norwich are paying for some of the most expensive season tickets in the Championship as well, but they continue to pack out that ground. Compared to when they're a Premier League club or Championship club, there's really not much of a difference between their attendances. But coming in at the top of the pile with the smallest fluctuation in crowds over this 10-year period, it's Southampton. Now, context certainly falls into their favour in this video, as a result of spending so many years in the Premier League that, you know, prior to this season in the Championship, they had spent the last decade in the top flight, and now coming down to the Championship, their crowds haven't really dipped in that time. It means that there has been the smallest change whatsoever in a 10-year period, and away fans visiting Southampton will influence these numbers as well. But a 3.5% change from their lowest to highest point over the last decade is absolutely minuscule when you compare it to the rest of the list. But guys, there we have it. That will now wrap it up for today's video. Thank you very much for tuning in. This one was just for a little bit of fun, but I hope you found it informative. If you did go on to enjoy, please do drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.